Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Tryon Palace Live. Thank you for joining us. I am Lindy Cummings, and today we're going to be talking about the 250th anniversary of the palace. Please post any questions in the comments, and I will try to answer a few of those at the end of the presentation. All right, let's get started. So as many of you know, last year the palace commemorated the 60th anniversary of the grand opening of the reconstruction. That was April of 1959. And this year we are celebrating another important anniversary, and that is the 250th anniversary of the original palace building. And of course that palace building burned in the 1790s, and that was the one that was reconstructed in the 1950s. So on December 5th of 1770, at the request of Royal Governor William Tryon, the members of the General Assembly's upper and lower houses met for the first time in the council chamber, and this was in the new government house at New Bern, North Carolina. Tryon opened with a kind of a grand welcome and a gesture to the community. He stated that he gladly embraced the opportunity here offered me of making my grateful acknowledgments to the country for the gift of this elegant and noble structure for the residence of myself and successors in administration, a palace that is a public ornament and a credit to the colony, a construction that will remain a lasting monument to the liberality of this country. The day was also marked with a celebration of King George III's birthday, complete with a royal salute fired from a battery and a grand ball in the newly opened palace. Along with the ball, there was a bonfire, lots of alcohol, and what was reported to be a very grand and surprising exhibition of fireworks. And if any of those things sound vaguely familiar, it is because some of those things are recreated every year during our candlelight Christmas celebration, namely the ball in the palace and the grand exhibition of fireworks. Not so much the bonfire or the vast quantities of alcohol that they used to drink in the 18th century. All right, so this is the story that we typically tell about the palace. In 1764, a young military officer named William Tryon, with important political connections, through his wife's family, arrived in North Carolina to take the place of the aging royal governor, Arthur Dobbs. Very quickly, the new, young replacement realizes that what the province really needs is a central place of government. And having brought along the services of a young and talented architect named John Hawkes, Tryon sets about planning a new provincial capital. In 1767, those plans are approved by the Board of Trade in London and King George III. And after 3 years and 15,000 pounds, the new government house or palace is open for business. In truth, however, the story of the palace is more than 3 years in the making. And so I want to do today is to look at the history of the palace over a much longer period of time and explore some of the aspects of the palace that are seldom the subject of focus, such as how remarkable was the palace when you compare it to other British American colonies, and who were the people that were laboring to construct the building. So why did it take almost 100 years before the province of North Carolina settled its capital into one place? And so really there's kind of two facets to this delay. And one of those is geographical and the other is political. So let's take a quick tour through early North Carolina history. In 1663, as a reward for supporting his return to the throne, King Charles II granted a large swath of southeastern North America to 8 powerful supporters: Edward Hyde, George Monk, William Lord Craven, John Lord Berkeley, Anthony Ashley Cooper, Sir George Carteret, Sir William Berkeley, and Sir John Colleton. These 8 men were the Lords Proprietors of North Carolina, a landholding that extended from the Albemarle Sound and then to the modern state boundary between Georgia and Florida today. So it's a very large portion. And then stretching far west as they could possibly conceive, which of course is going to be quite some time before Lewis and Clark make it to the Pacific, so they don't really know how big that western territory is. None of the proprietors, save Sir William Berkeley, who was governor of Virginia, ever visited their landholdings here in North America. So as a result, their efforts to manage and govern were disorganized at best and disastrous at worst. They had the brilliant idea to organize the colony along the lines of a feudal system in which manors owned by the nobility would be worked by lower-class people with no opportunity to acquire land themselves. A feudal system, however, was impossible to maintain if neither the lords nor the nobility were in residence on the manors. And one of the reasons that people were coming here was because there was the possibility of owning your own land. And in England, there was less of that land available and was already consolidated into large landholdings. So you can imagine that people were not going to be interested in coming to North Carolina or the Carolinas to set up shop on a manor ruled by a nobleman. The governors did try to appoint, there were governors appointed by the proprietors, but in absence of any kind of direct leadership, most of those governors were ineffectual at best or bent on self-enrichment. There was also a lot of tension between governors and local political leaders, and there were some various rebellions. Shown here on the slide that you see is a 3/4 portrait in oil of William, the first Earl of Craven. And of course, many of our residents will recognize Craven's name because we have a county named after him. The other issue was one of geography. So unlike South Carolina or Virginia, coastal North Carolina really has no natural deep water ports. And we have our barrier islands, which prevent easy navigation. There's also no substantial settlements in the area until the early part of the 18th century, although there are settlers trickling down from Virginia before the Lords Proprietors were awarded the region. The region that was settled first was around the Albemarle Sound, and as Virginia had grown and land and power were consolidated in the hands of fewer and fewer planters and their families, indentured servants, free blacks, and enslaved people were looking southward for potential settlement areas. The Great Dismal Swamp offered a barrier between Virginia and the wild lands of what would become North Carolina. And the descendants of those first settlers in the Albemarle region would be the political resistance against governors appointed by the Lords Proprietors and royal governors appointed by the king until the population eventually evened out across the seaboard. So there's one historian of early North Carolina who comments that the story of North Carolina fits none of the familiar models of colonial American history. Protestant dissenters came to seek freedom, but this was no city on a hill, so we're not Massachusetts. Ex-servants and sailors made it their home, but no port city bustled with politics and commerce, similar to Philadelphia or New York City or Boston or Charleston below us. That no city or town of any kind existed for most of the period, the early period, provides one clue to understand its society. The lack of a town eased concealing one's presence from any government inspector, collector, or law enforcement officer whom the proprietors might appoint. So it's kind of a wild place without much law. So in 1729, North Carolina shifts from being a proprietary colony to a royal colony. And of course, by 1729, all of those original lords proprietors are long dead, and their shares, their 1/8 shares in the colony have been passed down, sometimes to descendants, sometimes to the nearest living relative. There was even one section that eventually ended up being given as a wedding gift to a relative. And one can kind of imagine, like, well, what are we going to get, John and Sally when they get married? Well, we have this 1/8 share of a colony, like, let's just give them that. But no sense of investment from those individuals. So by the time the shift occurs, where it goes from being a proprietary to a royal colony, there are a handful of tiny towns, but really nothing compared to the expansion of Charleston, South Carolina, or Williamsburg, Virginia. In fact, in Williamsburg, by the time North Carolina is becoming a proprietary, or going from proprietary to royal colony, Williamsburg's governor's palace is getting its finishing touches. Alexander Spotswood is adding the gardens and grounds, which are recreated today. In North Carolina, Bath is the oldest town in the colony, and, of course, New Bern. They had been established in 1706 and 1710, respectively. Beaufort was settled and named a port of entry. It was settled in 1715 and becomes port of entry in 1722. Edenton is incorporated in 1722. Brunswick, near the mouth of the Cape Fear, was established by the Moore brothers in 1725, and Wilmington was established in 1733. So we are starting to see some evening out across the seaboard of our settlements. But these were very small cities, or towns, really. They don't have a large population. The largest population is still located in the Albemarle. Gabriel Johnston was the second royal governor of the province, beginning in 1734, and he would be in office until 1752. Johnston was faced with many challenges. There was a problem collecting quit rents, which were the land taxes due to the king, and those had doubled when the colony had become a royal colony, and that made a lot of people very unhappy. There was, to Johnston's mind, a distressing lack of established religion and education, so he was devoted to focusing on bringing in more ministers of the gospel. And basically, there was a society for the propagation of the gospel in foreign parts. They were basically treating North Carolina like a mission field. There was also a lot of sectional conflict between more established parts of the province, and of course those were around the Albemarle Sound, and newer parts like Wilmington. So amidst these more pressing issues that are facing Johnston during his administration, including the fact that his salary was always in arrears, so he was never really getting paid, Johnston recognized that the colony had a great predicament. And that predicament was there was no central place for conducting all of the colony's official business. So Johnston wrote the Board of Trade. The Board of Trade is one of the governing bodies for the colonies. He wrote them in 1740, and he said, "I cannot help here remarking other great impediments to the dispatch of public business. The papers and records of several offices are so dispersed that I am frequently obliged to send to one end of the province to another for them. This is entirely owing to the want of a town near the center of the country." So you can imagine if you needed to get a copy of your mortgage paperwork, for example, or the deed to your home or to your car, and you go to the central place of business and they say, well, that's great, but actually your deed is being held 200 miles from here, and we're going to put it on a cart and we're going to bring it down, and maybe it won't get here, or maybe it's been lost. That would really impede public business. So if you're trying to sell your car and you couldn't get your title, you might have to wait, and maybe that title would never show up. So this is one of the problems that is facing people in North Carolina. So Johnston, at the point that he's identifying the want of a town as one of the major impediments to effective government, he's been in office about 7 years. He began to push the assembly to legally establish a center of government for the colony. But because his greatest political opponents at the time were assemblymen from the Albemarle, he's also able to use this absence of a central location of government to his benefit. He initially selects Wilmington as the political center for his administration. The Cape Fear has a decent port, and strategically it's located far enough away from the Albemarle that assemblymen, when they're called, they were less likely or less able to get there in a timely manner. And then Johnston would face less opposition when he's presenting legislation. By 1747, however, he's really pushing hard to fix the seat of government at New Bern. It's more centrally located, and he wants to establish a tax to be collected in order to erect public buildings. So at the time that Johnston is pushing for a more central location for the government, what is the province's economic status? What does it look like? Well, one of the things you're going to see here on this table is a comparison between 3 colonies and then those 3 colonies combined compared to Jamaica. Starting in 1740, the Surveyor General of the Southern Colonies, who was Robert Dinwiddie, he was compiling reports supplying detailed information on the military strength, trade, commodity output, and the enslaved populations of British American colonies. So if we look at these numbers, we can get a sense of where North Carolina fell in the scale of its neighboring colonies, but also where it fell in comparison with Jamaica, which Jamaica was the highest producing sugar colony in the economic engine that was driving not only the British Empire, but also the economy of the entire Atlantic Basin. Sugar production is very important to all of the major economies, the French economy, the Spanish economy, and the British American economy at this time. Jamaica, Barbados are two of the most valuable colonies in the British collection. So if you look at these numbers, you'll notice immediately that the tally of fighting men, North Carolina has a significantly smaller group of fighting men than Virginia or South Carolina. Now, to be fair, Virginia has been established since 1609, so it has had some more time to mature. South Carolina, though, has about twice as many fighting men as North Carolina, and probably part of this is that South Carolina is a more desirable location. They pull in more settlers from Barbados, and they have that deep water port that North Carolina does not have. Dinwiddie took the number 5 and multiplied it by the number of fighting men to come up with a rough estimate of total inhabitants. And you can see there that North Carolina is about 12,500 inhabitants, whereas Virginia has 120,000 and South Carolina has 25,000. So it is very small in comparison to its neighbors. When you get to the actual numbers for exports, that's where you truly start to see a difference. And this is what's going to matter most to the British government when they're valuing their 27 colonies that are in the Caribbean and North America. North Carolina is importing very little. Now, imports being goods that they are importing from Great Britain, manufactured goods, fabric, tools, glass, paper, nails, that type of thing. They're importing significantly less than their neighbors, Virginia and South Carolina. Their exports are also smaller too. Unlike Virginia, which has tobacco, and South Carolina, which has rice, North Carolina's major export just really can't come close to touching the value of its fellow colonies. So its export values are much smaller. Now, if you compare those 3 colonies with Jamaica, you really see a strong difference. Jamaica has a much smaller group of inhabitants. Now, these are counting white inhabitants only. This is not counting enslaved populations. So you can see here that North Carolina, Virginia, and South Carolina have a significantly larger population, but when you look at the imports, they're being dwarfed. The imports for the 3 colonies combined are only $370,000, whereas Jamaica has $1.2 million. Now, important to keep in mind here that the import numbers also include the importation of enslaved people. So they are counting what they called, quote, the trade to Guinea or the transatlantic slave trade in those import numbers. So North Carolina, Virginia, and South Carolina are importing a smaller number of enslaved people, but Jamaica, again, is importing the lion's share of that. And that is because sugar is a arduous crop to cultivate and process. And it is, basically chews up and spits out its workers. And so indentured servants are not interested in laboring in these kind of conditions, whereas enslaved people don't have a choice. In your exports, the combined colonies, North Carolina, Virginia, and South Carolina, are exporting a little bit more than Jamaica, but Jamaica's export is a little bit more valuable. And then you can see in foreign trade, Jamaica is blowing those 3 colonies out of the water. And of that 20,000 pounds in foreign trade, North Carolina is doing none of that. They have 0 pounds in foreign trade. So if we look at these numbers, we can kind of get a sense of where North Carolina is falling in scale of its neighbors, but also in comparison with Jamaica, as I've said. We have fewer inhabitants, they're living on smaller scale farms, they're producing less valuable export crops, or simply less of a valuable export crop that's produced by a neighboring colony. And tobacco is a good example of that. Virginia and North Carolina are both producing tobacco, but whereas Virginia is going to produce about 35,000 hogsheads of tobacco, North Carolina is only producing about 2,000, so just a small amount. Well, where are our major ports at this time? So we do have 5 major ports: Brunswick, Beaufort, Bath, Roanoke, and Currituck. And you'll see here on the map that our major towns are also marked. So we have Wilmington and Newbern and Edenton, and then our other ports there are marked as well. The major exports for the province are naval stores, tar, turpentine, pitch, and lumber. These materials are produced as a byproduct of the plentiful pine forests across the eastern half of our province. They're also producing deer skins, foodstuffs like corn and livestock, and a much smaller quantity of flour, indigo, and rice are also being exported. And indigo and rice are a larger export out of South Carolina. So again, it's that we're exporting a valuable crop, but just a smaller amount of a valuable crop. Each port is exporting something slightly different from the other and at varying volumes. So most naval stores are being shipped from the port of Brunswick on the Cape Fear, while tobacco and fish are being shipped out of Roanoke. Beaufort is doing a little bit of everything, as is Bath, and then Currituck is the smallest port, and it's chiefly exporting lumber, corn, and deer skins. So what does the economic cycle look like that's kind of driving the provincial engine here? So the economy is always strained by a lack of hard currency. And how is this? So the main economic theory of the 18th century is mercantilism. And basically it's acting like a two-way street. Whatever is produced in the colonies flows to Great Britain or a fellow British colony, and then finished goods are flowing back to the colonies. This is why so many of the materials for the palace are imported. Finished goods simply aren't available in the colonies. In the economic cycle that you see here on the screen, naval stores are being exported. But by the time they've made a sea voyage to a fellow colony or to Great Britain, so Scotland, Ireland, Wales, or England, the market may have shifted. It may have been desirable when things were shipped out, but maybe by the time it gets there, the demand has lessened. Thus, the return on exports is inconsistent. You ship your goods to market, but there's no guaranteed market when it actually gets there. So many North Carolina export goods, they're also stigmatized for their poor quality. Naval stores, for example, yes, they're produced, they're plentiful, but the British Navy actually preferred the quality of stores that they could get from the Baltic region. So as a result, North Carolina merchants are relying heavily on credit, which means that there's always a shortage of hard currency in the colony. So you're shipping your naval stores, it's getting to London, maybe the market's not as good, so you're borrowing on credit against what you hope your sales are going to be. Then you are purchasing goods from London, having them shipped over on credit. So there's never actually any hard currency in this cycle. The shortage of currency is a problem for all of the colony, but it's especially true for the backcountry. Residents are relying on barter to purchase items that are imported, and they have great difficulty scrounging up actual money with which to pay their taxes. And it isn't just a problem for taxpayers. Royal governors, too, they have to send the colonies taxes in the form of hard currency, but no currency is coming back into the colony, or very little is coming back into the colony. So the circulation is very tight. So Johnston, in the midst of all of this, he does end up getting his law passed to fix the seat of government at Newbern, but he doesn't live to see that actually happen. He actually dies in office in 1752, probably buried it in the Edenton vicinity, although the exact location has been lost. And after about a 2-year period during which they had an interim governor, Arthur Dobbs is appointed the third royal governor. He's appointed by George II. So Dobbs comes at a critical moment. His first challenge is to deal with the military defense of the province, since the American colonies are mired in what we now call the French and Indian War, and what is known more broadly as the 7 Years' War between Great Britain and France. But in the midst of this, Dobbs' second challenge is to deal with the issue of a provincial capital. So in 1758, an act for erecting a city on the Neuse River was passed by the Assembly. And in it was a provision for establishing a new capital. And one would guess from the title that if we're establishing a city on the Neuse River, well, this has to be Newbern, and that's actually incorrect. Dobbs did not really like Newbern. He felt that it was humid and damp and unhealthy, and he instead chose a location that is more close to present-day Kinston, than it is to New Bern. He also owned some property there, which he was really willing to sell at cost to the assembly. He wanted the new government seat to be at this place called Tower Hill, and as part of that development, there would be a government house and offices, an assembly building, probably to be modeled after Virginia's House of Burgesses at Williamsburg, and supporting offices. And then, of course, critically, all of the records would be transported to the new capital so that everything would be in one place. Would not, in the words of Gabriel Johnston, have to send from one end of the province to another just to get hold of a record. Unfortunately, despite the act settling the capital at Tower Hill, there was no traction made on actually establishing a capital there. In 1764, James Davis, the official printer to the colony, appointed by Dobbs, he wrote an editorial on the critical state of government records, and this is what he said. Can you see the public records carted from place to place, and your properties and estates trusted to the mercy of a shower of rain, and at the discretion of a cart driver? Forbid it, heaven. And of course, there are no really good roads at this time, and as I said earlier, they did consume a lot of alcohol, so, one presumes that the cart driver might be drunk. So it really is a risk to see the records driven about like this. Gabriel Johnston had described it as thus: the public records lie in a miserable condition in one part of them in Edenton, near the Virginia line, in a place without lock or key. A great of them in the Secretary's house at Cape Fear, above 200 miles distance from the others, and some of them at the Clerk of Council's house at New Bern, so that in whatever part of the colony a man happens to be, if he wants to consult any paper or record, he must send 100 miles before he can come at it. And just to kind of illustrate how dispersed these records were, in 1912, so a considerable amount of time later, Mary Norcott Bryan recalled as a child visiting friends and finding barrels of old letters and interesting documents from royal governors' terms that dated to the 18th century, really speaking to the haphazard nature of how official records were handled before there was a capital. And one of the things that this lack of organization does is it exacerbates some of the land claim issues in the Carolina backcountry, where forged claims to land ownership are a big problem. There's also failure to document purchases, and there's other outright fraudulent actions that are troubling all of the royal governor's administration. So while Dobbs and Johnston are trying to sort all of this out, you have the problem of the problem is just continuing to multiply. So Dobbs, too, died in office without seeing a developed goal in place for a government seat. And at the time of his death, the plans for the capital had been floated by two royal governors since 1740. So this is about 20 years later. The proposed site had been moved from Wilmington to New Bern, to Tower Hill to New Bern. And one of the things that he does when he comes into office is William Tryon immediately identifies that the, quote, itinerant public assemblies are a source of the contentions of the province. And while the assembly had occasionally met at Edenton or Bath in the early years, by and large by this point, Wilmington or New Bern were really the dominant meeting spots. So one of the things that Tryon does is he quickly moves to establish and erect a new seat of government. And of course, he had brought along with him a skilled architect named John Hawkes. In 1766, Tryon spoke with members of the Assembly and the Royal Council. He noted that establishing a seat of government had, quote, been recommended from the Crown and will be a means of removing those inconveniences the governors of this province have labored under for want of a proper house of accommodation. The proposal, which was read before the Assembly in November 1766, passed on the first vote, establishing New Bern as a seat of government and authorizing Tryon to purchase lots and design and construct a building. £5,000 were allowed to pay for the construction, and duties were leveraged on imported alcohol to raise the necessary funds, and there was also a new 8-pence poll tax. So we'll talk about poll taxes in a moment and how those functioned. So as Tryon was getting his plans underway for the seat of government and getting those approved by the Assembly, John Hawkes, the architect who had come with Tryon, was already making preliminary drawings of a possible government house. The one that you see here is one of the earliest renderings, and it's tentatively dated 1766. And one of the things you'll notice is that it does look remarkably similar to the palace that we know today, but there are some critical differences. Notice the portico around the front door and also the sort of decorative pilasters and columns around that second floor window. There's also third floor kind of half windows for the attic, which we don't have those on the palace today. And also, if you look at the floor plans, this particular structure is only a room deep on the first floor with staircases running up both ends of the buildings. And then on the second floor, they're kind of subdivided, but for all intents and purposes, they're only about 2 rooms deep. The building is not very wide or deep, which is very different from the building that we know today. But you'll notice that it has the curved attachments between the outbuildings, or at least it seems to on this particular drawing. So this is the first set of plans. Hawks subsequently worked on a second and third set of plans. By January of 1767, he and Tryon had signed an agreement, a contract, stating that Hawks would superintend the palace building in all its aspects, but he would also be responsible for hiring laborers and purchasing materials. The term allowed was for 3 years, so he had to get the building finished in 3 years, and for that he would be paid an annual salary of £300. In February of 1767, Tryon conveyed to a relative and a political benefactor in London a plan and elevation of the edifice with the offices to be erected at Newburn. The first bricks were laid in August of 1767, and by the end of the year, Tryon had presented the plans to the Assembly and asked for more funding. The Assembly was really cautious about incurring more debt. They still had a substantial amount of debt that Dobbs had raised in defense of the colony during the French and Indian War, and they had not paid that down. But they did vote to raise an additional £10,000 for constructing the palace. And until those funds were raised, Tryon was authorized to borrow money from wealthy businessmen. And how were those funds raised? Well, they levied another poll tax of 2 shillings 8 pence on every taxable individual, which included, so a taxable is any white male over age 16 and people of color, both male and female over age of 12. The tax would be paid over a 3-year period. So the 2 shilling tax was an addition, of course, to the 8 pence tax that was already levied for the construction when the palace originally had voted in 1766. But this second tax, which is substantially larger, it was one of the leading causes for the Regulator Rebellion in 1768. Remember that families living in the backcountry, they're already cash poor. There's already very little currency circulating. And they're struggling with abuses of power from dishonest tax officials. Remember, like, these records are in disarray, so it's hard to track things and make sure that people are being honest in how they're collecting taxes. And now they have this additional burden of paying for this grand building, which not 1 man in 20 of the 4 most populous counties will ever see, according to a 1768 letter printed in the Boston Chronicle from a Mecklenburg County resident. And this was really the breaking point for those people. Alas, the end of the Regulators' Rebellion is a topic for another day, so we have to leave it there and go to talk about who actually built the palace. And who built the palace was one of the central questions that the original contract researcher for the palace in the 1930s and 40s, that was one of his central questions. Where did the manpower come from to build the palace? That gentleman was Alonzo T. Dill. He was working in the 40s and 50s to do the research that would become the foundation for the reconstruction. So one of the challenges that Tryon and Hawks faced was that there was a critical shortage of skilled labor available in North Carolina. Remember, our population is small. We don't have a lot of wealth. People with skilled labor sets are probably going to go to Charleston or are in Virginia, or in larger metropolises like Philadelphia, Boston, New York. During a visit with Tryon in 1768, New Hampshire's Governor John Wentworth had commented that the people of North Carolina are by no means inclined to any sort of manufacture, scarcely a shoemaker, a joiner, or a silversmith, but quits his trade as soon as he can get able to buy a little tract of land and build a cottage in the wilderness. So people were really more interested in purchasing land and establishing their own farms. Writing to his political benefactor, the Earl of Shelburne, Tryon commented that he was going to have to send John Hawkes to Philadelphia to hire able workmen. Hawkes was also authorized to purchase materials while he was in Philadelphia, and in 1767, Tryon composed a letter of introduction to an unknown recipient for John Hawkes to take with him, and that unknown recipient was asked to please help Hawkes select good working men and put in place reasonable contracts for goods and services. So by 1769, Tryon happily reported to a friend that the palace was covered in and roofed. 1769 was also the year that there was a fairly large hurricane, and while a good portion of New Bern was blown away, the palace remained undamaged, and we've been very fortunate that the palace has remained undamaged through the many hurricanes that the region has seen. When he was reporting to his friend that the palace was covered in and roofed, Tryon was also detailing where the materials were from and how they were being used. So lead for plumbing and the plumber or the skilled plumbers that were doing the work with that, all of that had come from London, the plumber and the lead. Frames and windows were also acquired from London. All of your household hardware like door locks and hinges, those were brought in from London too. The chimney pieces, particularly the Sienna marble one in the council chamber that Tryon was very proud of, this was also imported from London. There was just one problem. Tryon was very concerned that the building was so fine that his furniture and silver plate was just simply unsuitable. He wrote to a friend that what furniture I have here has been so abused that it would disgrace even the upper story of the edifice. So he's basically saying, my furniture is so bad, my family can't even use it on the second floor, which second floors were private spaces. Tryon did petition the king to show a mark of his royal approbation with a supply of more suitable furniture and plate, and the king said no. He said that that was too great a precedent, and then all of the other governors would want similar royal treatment. Tryon was not one to take no for an answer. A full year later, he was still pushing a friend to ask the king if he wouldn't reconsider the whole furniture and plate thing. He said, furniture may be obtained, and precedent ceased to be a bar to so well-directed a liberality. By June of 1770, Tryon reported to a friend that the palace was in such a state of completion that his family had moved in, and by the end of the year, of course, December 5th, 1770, he was hosting the assembly at a grand opening. So just how remarkable was the palace? And I think this is one of the questions that at the time people were saying, that this is one of the most beautiful buildings in North America. But how remarkable was the palace in all reality? So if we go back to one of the earlier slides where we talked about the economy of the province, and if we compare North Carolina to South Carolina and Virginia, and of course Jamaica, judging by the actual numbers, one would suppose that more financially successful colonies would have bigger and better seats of government. And only a handful of smaller Caribbean islands produced less of export value than North Carolina. And so if North Carolina is literally one of the poorest colonies or one of the least valuable colonies of the 27 in the British colonial arson, we would expect that they would maybe not be so remarkable in their place of government. Until the time of its unfortunate burning in 1798, the palace was esteemed one of the best buildings in North America. A visitor in the 1780s remarked that it was one of the best buildings in all of the Americas, so both North and South. And as it turns out, among North American colonies, having an official residence for the governor is actually unusual. First of all, not all colonies are royal colonies. Rhode Island and Connecticut are examples. Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson, he was in office during Tryon's time in North Carolina. He had his office in Province House, which is shown here in the slide. This was in Boston. That building was actually demolished early on. New York had a residence. It burned down several times and was rebuilt. A governor's residence burning down seems to be a common theme. Williamsburg's palace burned down too. New Jersey had what is known as Proprietary House, and that actually is still standing today. In South Carolina and Georgia, royal governors rented homes or resided in homes that they already owned. So in Charleston, for example, two locally born men, William Bull and his son, also William Bull, they just lived in their house, their townhouse at 43 Meeting Street in Charleston. So the photograph here is of 43 Meeting Street, and this is from the Historic American Building Survey out of the Library of Congress. That house is still standing. Other royal governors for South Carolina who came from outside the colony, they just rented homes. So Lord William Campbell in the 1770s rented the Miles Bruton House at 27 King Street, which still stands as a private residence. And then there were others that resided in a house on Colleton Square, which was owned by the Pinckney family. And some of you may recognize that surname. The Pinckneys were an influential patriot family out of South Carolina. One of the more interesting stories of a palace or a palace-like structure for a governor's residence is that of Bladen's Folly in Maryland. So Thomas Bladen was the proprietary governor of Maryland. He was really inspired by the governor's palace at Williamsburg, and he began constructing a similar structure, a residence, in 1744 with about 3,000 pounds that had been appropriated by Maryland's General Assembly. But as that building took shape, so did the opposition to it. 3 years later, in 1747, the construction was abandoned when the Assembly refused to appropriate additional funds to supplement the original amount. So the building was never completed. After the end of the American Revolution, the unfinished first floor of the building was finished by St. John's College and renamed McDowell Hall, and it still stands today. The photo that you see here is McDowell Hall in 2012. So that first floor is the first floor that remained from Bladen's Folly, all that was ever finished. Really then, Williamsburg does become one of the truly comparable official residences in the contiguous 13 colonies if we don't look at places like British Canada or the Caribbean, because those are kind of separate things. The palace at Williamsburg had been improved in 1705. Of course, that's even before New Bern has been founded, and construction began in 1706. The work, however, was very slow, and by 1718, it still wasn't completely finished. Alexander Spotswood, who served until 1722, he actually funded the construction of the gardens and grounds out of his own pocket, because by that point, the Assembly was really tired of levying taxes to pay for that building, and they felt that the expense had become too great. And that, I think, really was one of the major things that helped Tryon begin and complete the palace in such a timely manner. He quickly moved to secure the funds. He borrowed when he was authorized and when necessary, and then he kept it tightly within that 3-year time frame. Also had the services of John Hawks, so I think that speaks to Hawks' management. But the project at any point could have easily come to a halt, and the story ended more like Bladen's Folly, where you just ended up with the first floor unfinished. When Tryon approached the Assembly with the plans, they could have just easily refused to levy an additional tax. They didn't have to raise the additional 10,000 pounds. Remember, they were already conscious of the fact that they had more debts to pay off, and they're a cash-poor colony. Of course, those funds were not raised without difficulty. They became one of the leading reasons why the backcountry rebelled during the Regulator Rebellion. And, of course, that story ended with armed conflict at the Battle of the Alamance. And so while the story of Tryon Palace is one of success in that the building was completed, there were political consequences. So that is kind of a quick and nerdy look at the 250th anniversary of the palace, the original construction, some of the story leading up to that construction. And I want to thank you all for joining me this morning. And if we have any questions that I can answer. So let's see. So from Nancy, were the colony records stored at the palace after it was built? Yes, they were. That was one of the first things that Tryon did. He had all of the records gathered up and brought to the palace. And actually, probably more of them were probably stored at the courthouse or where the assembly was meeting, because there were probably more records than there was space at the palace. But yes, that was one of the first things that Tryon did, as you can imagine. No more carting them about. And we have another question here from Hannah. And she asks, did North Carolina have any wool products being brought to market? Not that I'm aware. And one of the reasons why that would not have maybe been as desirable for North Carolina to export wool is because Britain already had a very robust wool production and market. And if you're operating in a mercantilist system and you're producing wool in Great Britain, you want your colonies to buy your wool. And so they wouldn't necessarily have wanted something to come from the colonies that they were already producing themselves. That would have kind of undercut the whole mercantilist idea. So most wool products were being produced in Great Britain and then shipped to the colonies for consumption. And of course, during some of the resistance leading up to the American Revolution, one of the things that the colonists do is they commit to non-importation as a form of political rebellion to make a point about taxation without representation. And one of the things that they commit to not importing is fabrics that are produced in Great Britain. And fabrics are only produced in Great Britain, so they can't necessarily say, well, we're not going to import any fabrics, because then you have nothing to make clothes out of. But what they do say is, well, we're going to not import expensive stuff, or we're not going to buy expensive stuff. So in Newburn's paper, there's a whole list of items that they're not going to purchase, and then a list of items that's like, well, we're only going to purchase linen that's for 2 shillings a yard or less, or wool that's a certain price or less. So they can't not purchase these goods, but they commit to only purchasing the cheap goods. And so then we have another question here. What type and approximately how many horses were there at the palace after the construction? That's a good question. We know that Tryon and his successor had carriages, a post chaise, and a coach. Tryon paid to have his coach painted. And those vehicles were typically drawn by 2 to 4 horses. So one would assume that they probably had around 2 to 4. There might be a more exact number, and I could certainly look in the records to see if that exact number exists. I know that Josiah Martin, when he left the palace, he left in one of his vehicles drawn by his horses, and he ended up leaving them with a friend in Cross Creek, what's now Fayetteville. And if I check the records, maybe it will say how many horses he actually left with that friend. But I would imagine the number would be somewhere between 2 and 4. That would be most common, the number that would have drawn the vehicles that both governors had. So I want to thank you all for joining me. If you have any other research questions, I'm always happy to answer them. You can find my email on our website under the About tab. I'm there under the staff directory. So you can also message us through Facebook, and our marketing team will get me those questions. And I will happily, if I don't know the answer, I'll do a little research to find you an answer. So again, thank you for joining us. Join us tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. There's going to be a behind-the-scenes tour of our conservation lab, and that'll be a lot of fun, so we hope you'll all tune in then. Thanks. Have a great day.